Black History Month. Black history, yes. And the shortest amount of days possible to technically be considered a month? Also yes. While more accurate, the phrase Black History 4 weeks is less catchy. 28 days of Black history every February and not a day more, save for a quadrennial celestial anomaly which will give Black Americans 24 extra hours to learn about their forebears. But when you're a minority group fighting for acknowledgement in America, you have to pick your poison. Hispanic Heritage Month is from September 15th until October 15th every year. 30 days, but 15 in September, 15 in October. Black history only gets 28 days, but Hispanic Heritage gets a month, less like a title on a calendar and more like a Macy's return window. And while it is said that comparison is the thief of joy, sometimes looking at things comparatively is a good way to see how far things have come. Black History commemoration was first proposed at Kent State University in 1969, and at the time, students clamored and pleaded and positioned for Black History Week. Fortunately, after spirited organization by student activists, the Black United Students Group, and Dr. Edward Crosby, who established the first Black Studies program at Kent State University in 1969, Kent State celebrated Black History Month in February of 1970. And after that, nothing but good vibes at Kent State for the rest of 1970. And in 1976, President Gerald Ford officially designated Black History Month as a national holiday. But after almost 50 years of hard work, is it time for Black History Month to take an early retirement? Is Black history something we should still teach and celebrate? And this question isn't being asked in a Tucker Carlson coded way, but in the sense of, at this point, can't there be collective agreement that this great nation was built through the intelligence, innovation, and courage of a vast, diverse cadre of people, and if American history is taught comprehensively, all types of Americans will naturally and rightfully get credit for their contributions. Black history is American history, and at a certain point, Black History Month feels less like celebration and more like segregation. But why is Black history so marginalized in the grand conversation about the history of our country? Why is American history so Eurocentric? Besides the obvious macro issues like systemic bias in government and education, a more immediate and visceral explanation might be that white history is just more interesting. And that's because white history has the distinct advantage of being volumes and volumes of made-up bullshit. It turns out, if you fudge a few key details, you can create a yarn that people will excitedly gather around to watch be spun. And Black people's insistence on sticking to the facts is putting them at a great disadvantage. Go back to the beginning of both the United States and most people's historical education therein. George Washington and the cherry tree? He chopped it down and confessed his misdeed by proclaiming, "I cannot tell a lie." But, ironically, the whole story is a lie. It never happened. But it's a cool story, real forefather myth-making shit. And that's how you get into the history books. Although, the story always seemed a bit off, true or not. It was meant to display Washington's saint-like honesty, but is that really the best story to illustrate that? Especially if you can make up anything from scratch. Is it more important not to lie or not to be wildly impulsive? Go fuck your buddy's girlfriend, tell him about it, and see if blown away by your radical honesty is his lead reaction. But even though that story isn't true, it does seem to articulate an important personality trait needed to be an American president. Not honesty, but the ability to do something violent and reckless while standing 10 toes down with a steely-eyed, sociopathic gaze on your face and flatly stating, "Yeah, I did that shit." A defining presidential characteristic carried all the way from the tall tale of an adolescent George Washington to the real-life reign of a candidate who ran on hope and then killed 324 civilians with drone strikes. But whether the first president or the first Black president, both men knew that the way to cement yourself into the history books was by hiring a sympathetic and imaginative biographer. And that's what you'll notice about the crossover figures of history, the Black Americans who moved from Black history to history. You'll notice an exaggeration and avoidance of the bare facts. George Washington Carver, the peanut guy. What an eccentric dude. Got obsessed with the peanut. So wacky, so interesting. Fun guy, cool story. You made it into the history books. Let's move on. But that's why he's in the history books, because an obsessed eccentric can. Who can't? A former slave whose birth name isn't Carver, but who goes by Carver because that was his master's name. A man who came up with 300 uses for the peanut because recently emancipated black sharecroppers needed a crop that could replenish the soil, which had been left in ruin from years of industrial cotton farming, and needed a homegrown food source with adequate protein and nutritional value. A scientist who evangelized his southern soil-saving farming techniques to Great Plains farmers post-Dust Bowl, and who spoke in front of Congress, getting them to pass tariffs on cheap Chinese peanut imports so that those same farmers in the South and Midwest wouldn't be driven back into the poverty they had grown themselves out of. Slavery, yuck. Class solidarity, double yuck. Peanut butter, yum. He invented peanut butter. Let's move on. Except, ironically, peanut butter, one of the things most associated with Carver, was not one of the many peanut derivatives he invented. Peanut butter's creation is credited to the Aztecs, so save peanut butter conversations for between September 15th and October 15th. And then, of course, there's Martin Luther King Jr., a complex, radical, magnanimous man who has been ground down to a tasteless paste, palatable for public consumption. American history has no room for complexity, so MLK is trotted out like a mascot, like the Smokey the Bear of tolerance, going from classroom to classroom every winter saying, "Only you can prevent racism." Because no one wants to hear about how, while he had some disagreements, he ultimately agreed with many observations made by Karl Marx, and people want to hear about the civil disobedience but not read the jailhouse letters, like this one from Birmingham in 1963, where King writes, quote, "First, I must confess that over the last few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season." People don't want to know that if King were alive today, walking down your street, he'd be just as bristled by your neighbor's Trump flag as he would be by your "In This House We Believe" yard sign. But, for better or worse or neutral, if you're a fan of government-sanctioned periods of Black remembrance, you're in luck, because we're getting more, not less. In 2021, Juneteenth was codified as a federal holiday. Once a small celebration in Texas that spread to other Black communities, Juneteenth is now celebrated every June by the entire country, in total. You can now walk into a Walmart at the tail end of spring and pick up a Juneteenth t-shirt. You can now celebrate the end of chattel slavery in America by wearing a shirt made by a wage slave in the Philippines. And that's a quintessential illustration of progress in America. If you work hard enough and smart enough, you can make it to the top of the mountain. But there's no guarantee that you'll like the view.